So Caroline, Paula, and I have been working on bringing this content to you for the last few months. And when we first got started, we had all these war stories and felt like that was a great opportunity to really help you to understand and navigate today. We've got some great speakers, and it's going to be an awesome thing. So real quick, a little bit about me. I am one of the people who started DevSecOps long ago, didn't really know it, and then decided to finally name what it was that I found along the way. And I also write comic strips and do crazy things, including starting things like trying to get more women into cybersecurity. So enough about me. What you might want to know is why we're trying to get DevSecOps to be at the heart of the DevOps movement. And that's because security is something that's too important to leave out. DevOps has been growing as a movement since around 2012 when hiring became a big deal. And if you're trying to ground yourself in this movement, what it is and how you're going to take place in it, it's really about trying to put some understanding towards why this movement is so important. DevOps is very much a big part of why software is starting to take over and eat the world. And when you start to think about that, it's kind of interesting because more and more people are wanting to collaborate, to do things with each other, and to really change how software is defined and developed. Why is that? Well, growth has been exponential in the cloud. And when we think about that, growth being exponential, that means that there's all kinds of opportunities and things that come with it. And along with that comes a lot of innovation. I know at my company, innovation's a big part of what we think we do every day. And we produce some wonderful things for our customers. But that's at the spirit of the movement that we have, which is defining customer problems and solving them. Ultimately, with the cloud growth, comes a whole bunch of change. One of the big changes that came along with this was security. And if you think about it, back when, I think it was in 2013, Josh Corman actually gave a couple of talks. One of his first talks was, this is the end of security as we know it, with the cloud and the entry of DevOps. And maybe a little while later, he added, and isn't this a good thing? And as a security professional, I gotta tell you, the first time I heard it, my heart sank. I thought I was gonna have to change careers, go back to being a developer, or maybe even getting those 1-inch pizza boxes being sent to my house so I could put the new disk in. And when he said, isn't it a good thing, it really caused me to pause for a moment. And when I think about that, it's why we're all here today, because really this movement that we have, which is DevSecOps, is really about bringing more security to software faster, shifting left. You're gonna hear a lot of these things today. Start to put some sense to it. And what I would tell you is look for things that are measurable. Today we're going to share a whole bunch of war stories. We're going to tell you a lot of things as different companies standing up here, mostly practitioners, that there's a lot of change in this movement. So I remember when, here's my head-banging moment, and we're all three going to share some head-banging moments with you. I remember when I first got to the company I was at. I'm at Intuit. When you look at Intuit's capabilities, I got there and I realized that we were moving to the cloud. And we were starting to be DevOps. And while I had come from other cloud companies and I had come from other DevOps companies, and I knew the journey was tough, and I knew mostly for security professionals, because as a security professional, I'm going to admit to you, I was the house of no. I worked for a lot of different companies, and I would say compliance was one of those things where you don't really deviate from compliance requirements. You have to meet them. You have to meet the bar. And knowing that is a really big deal. So for us, what I found was that it was really hard to try and understand the speed, the scale of doing all the things that you had to do well so that you could embrace security in software. I mean, how many in the room have tried to get security into software for so many years and only to find that their AppSec programs have really struggled? Anybody? Yeah, lots of hands. And I'll tell you, as a security professional who's also been a developer and an operations person, it's been rough. So I wanted to have Paula also share a little bit about her headbanging moment.
Sure. So I'm Paula Thrasher. and I work for General Dynamics IT, which is a large federal systems integrator, and I've been in the federal space for a long time. To give a little bit of my background, I was a developer for 15 years, and then I sort of took a weird left turn and became an IT director, operations manager. And so I went from all of a sudden being the person who was sort of hacking the servers to the person running the servers that didn't want any developer anywhere near my servers because I knew what they could do. And that was kind of my DevOps moment, and that led to some transformations and some journeys that I went on starting in 2010 when I made that switch. So my headbanging story was sometime later, and it was 2015, and I had just led a large DevOps transformation for a program that had about 400 folks in the organization, 28 development teams, IT operations. I had a whole security team. It was a great transformation, and that was going really well. And the DevOps had really, just that whole culture, but also the automation was huge for us, going faster and getting great results. But we had a new requirement that came in, and it was a new customer and a new program. And as happens in federal, Congress passed a law in October, and it had to be active by January 1. So not a lot of time to build a whole brand new thing because you got basically 7 weeks. So we thought, well, okay, we know how to do this. That's DevOps. So we assembled our best team. I had a really hotshot UX person. I had great developers. I had a good cloud architect. We were, cloud was non-negotiable in 6 weeks. We can't even order a server that fast. We were going to do all the things that we had just done at this huge scale. I had a DevOps automation engineer. I had testers. We did automated testing. And over the course of that 6 weeks, that team deployed to production, which was to Amazon, not officially production, but production, right? Because it's the same thing in the cloud, 152 times. And if you do the math, that's more than once a day. And they wrote 88 automated tests, and they had automated security scanning, and we had automated style checking, we had automated performance testing. Every time it made it all the way to production, it ran a big performance load testing. We were using a lot of components. We were doing component security. To me, I thought, we are like the model of how we should be doing security and DevOps. Go us, big pat on the back. So the first time that I actually saw a security person in the course of that entire project was the Thursday before go live in the official, go live meeting. We need one of those change control boards, and they show up and they look at all of our, and I go, look at all our tests, right? And I pulled it all up, and I was very proud of ourselves, and they went, yeah, looks pretty good. Okay, green light, right? And I think we overwhelmed them with data, and they agreed, and we went live, and it was Monday morning, and people are starting to use the system, and the SOC calls. And they say, you're being hacked. And I went, oh, how are we being hacked? Well, it looks like, and honestly, it doesn't really matter. It was 2015, and this is many years ago, but the gist of it was this component plus that component, and when you mix them together, you have a vulnerability. And then, oh, by the way, it comes up, yeah, there was a 0 day with one of those components about 3 weeks ago. Didn't you get the memo? No. I would have been good to know 3 weeks ago when we had a decision. And that was when I realized that waiting to the very end, even with all of this, developers are going to carry pagers and, no ops, maybe no dev, I don't know. It didn't make sense that security showed up at the end. Even when we had all these automation, we still needed the expertise. And so that was the moment when I decided that it wasn't just, dev and ops, and we can figure it out. We'll do the security thing. Leave us alone, because you'll just say no. We really needed to embrace having security in the room when we were making the decisions, not just at the end when we hit the, magic go live.
Good morning, I'm Caroline Wong. I'm gonna talk to you about what it's like to be the security person that is not invited into the room. I am currently the Vice President of Security Strategy for a pen test as a service company called Cobalt, based in San Francisco. I started my security career 13 years ago. at eBay and at Zynga, leading security teams. And these were super cool places to begin my security career. In both cases, we were running online operations 24/7 with millions of simultaneous users daily. eBay had an uptime requirement of 99.94%. Zynga was growing incredibly rapidly and was an early adopter of Amazon AWS. In 2009, Farmville launched. Farmville was this like Facebook game that you could play on your phone. And in a few weeks, the game went from 0 to 10 million daily active users. A few months later, it was 80 million daily active users. At Zynga, we also had these incredible data stores. One game would log more than 30 billion transactions a day. So in this type of environment, why does security matter? Well, there's compliance reasons. You don't want a breach. And in Zynga's case, we were getting ready to go public. So an IPO means you have to be SOX compliant. At eBay, I remember when we were doing a ton of defect discovery, lots of finding bugs, pen testing and scanning and getting information from security researchers via responsible disclosure. And every week it seemed, we would go to the development teams and we would say, here's a pile of bugs. It's super important that you fix these right now. And they would say, they would like close the door. And then they would stop showing up to our meetings. And as a security professional, this is, perhaps it's common. It's also really a bummer because it can feel like you're not accomplishing stuff at work. We were finding all sorts of stuff, but that's only half of the solution. You've got to find it and you've also got to fix it. At Zynga, we thought, oh, the company's getting ready to go public. We've got this big stick, you know, and so I did what I thought was the right thing to do, which is I took the NIST 853 standard, which happens to be 387 pages long, and I customized it for Zynga, and I brought it down to like 50 pages. And then I started trying to set up meetings with technology stakeholders to get them to buy into our policy, and guess what? Nobody would show up to my meetings. So we tried something different. You know, the CISO at the time at Zynga said, well, we need people to understand that security is not just our job, it's their job too. Let's make a roles and responsibilities matrix. And we made this gorgeous RASCI matrix. And we said, here's what everyone is supposed to do. I'm pretty sure no one read it. And as a security professional, it's super frustrating because at that time, my headbanging moment, which happened a lot, was, why doesn't anyone care?
Wow, both of those stories resonate really well with me. And when you start thinking about your headbanging moment, I'm sure they sound very similar. If you think about it, why do we struggle so hard with getting bugs fixed? Why do we struggle so hard with making software safer? It's a real big challenge, and I don't think there's that many security practitioners in the room who have chased bugs before that could say, you know what, it went extremely well when I turned over that really long CSV file with all those bugs in it to a bunch of developers that said, wait a minute, there's a bunch of false positives, things are not exactly clear to me, how do I fix this? Everything got done, right? Not exactly. So the Epiphany Moment is something we also wanted to share with you. For me, the Epiphany Moment was very much about this Wardley map. If you're not aware of what Wardley is, a Wardley map is basically something that helps you kind of predict the future. What's emerging tech? What is more of your commodity? How are you thinking about what's important to your customer? And really, how does that drive you? And when I think about what caused our change along the way in many of the companies that I worked at, it was really getting customer focused. What does security mean to a consumer? What does security mean to a developer? And who's really driving? Is the role of the security professional to be able to figure out exactly what it is that somebody should be doing, making all the decisions and ensuring software safety with very little context? And the answer that I came up with was not exactly. In fact, no. And so when you think about this worldly map, the cloud was making an emergence. It came after compute when you couldn't get a box when you were a developer and you had frustration, and frustration led to the next change and the next change. And well, so many changes are led by frustration. And one of the frustrating things when you're working in the cloud and in DevOps is speed. If you don't have speed, you're not actually producing value for customers, in which case the DevOps movement, which is all about value and flow, value and speed, is something that gets crushed by security. And so my epiphany moment was sitting in a room full of people realizing that there was no way at the very tail end that I was going to ever get them to realize that they owned security, that they were the people who had to ensure that security was baked in. We've all seen it, built-in security, right? And that was the way forward, but how to get people to do it, really? And the epiphany led to, well, this is your decision. I'm just here to help you make a good one. And so if you think about that for just a moment, what is it that the maturity of a life cycle like this looks like? Sort of led to the beginning of what is a maturity model that I hope to soon see evolved into many more things that have to evolve. And you're going to see later on today that we're working on something like this. But for us, this maturity model started with, how do you change the culture? How do you evolve? What is it that you have to have for skills? Who has to have these skills? Is it enough for developers to take over security and really the role of a security professional is going by the wayside? In fact, we were all going to somehow eventually become extinct. The answer to that question is no. And it comes from what you measure. So if you're starting out in DevSecOps, you're probably going to measure things like defect density and SLAs. I wouldn't have ever believed it, but in my organization, we meet our SLAs for really critical bugs. I would never have believed if you had told me years ago that I was going to ever work for a company that could get to their critical bugs within 2 days, that I'd be part of a unicorn company, that it could ever happen. But with DevSecOps, it did. And so when you think about all the things that you have to evolve, one of the first things you got to evolve is who's really on the hook for making software safe. And then, if you think about it, measuring your defect density is a real measure. SLA adherence is a real measure. And if you're not in SLAs, you should ask yourself why. But the final measure that we came up with, and I think that I'd love to provoke this audience to understand today, is you should be asking your developers, your DevOps teams, how many adversaries does your application actually have? And I'm going to tell you, it's a turning point for every developer I've worked with, because it's going to have them looking for the adversary, interested in what they're actually doing to their application, and not thinking about the FUD of what is being proposed out there as the most important things for them to fix. That was my epiphany moment, and it's led to a whole bunch of people that are really interested in security at the last few companies that I've worked for. And I would say that they are at the top of the list of unicorns. And what's great about that is that there's so many more coming. Today, there's going to be some amazing people, in addition to these ladies up here with me, that are going to tell you stories about some of the new emerging unicorns. And it's because they've followed a path much like this one. Paula?
Sure. So I want to talk, the first epiphany of bringing security into the team. And one of my recent epiphanies with some projects we've been working on recently. So one of the things that my team does as we come into programs that are adopting DevOps, adopting cloud, adopting infrastructure automation, is we try to bring a standard practice around a pipeline. And so we're trying to bring to teams that we have, all the code is in source code. That's actually shockingly not as common as I thought it should be. but that also infrastructure is in source, and configurations, and all of your executable files and your artifacts, and all of those things come from source, and they're all configuration controlled. And then eventually we want to automate everything in the build, including the security scanning, static application scanning, ideally evolving to dynamic application scanning, getting into, runtime performance tests. That's not like a big lead up, but something that runs every time the build, progresses to a certain state, doing all of these things in an automated fashion, ultimately working to a deployment model where the infrastructure is deployed. Again, it's usually scripted. Sometimes that's with a Chef or Ansible is our two most common, and sometimes it's with PowerShell. But all of these things are automated, and it goes forward and it follows a standard pipeline. And we've done this for about 11 customers right now, where we've come in, this doesn't exist, and we start this adoption model. But I had one in particular really take off, and that was interesting to me because I wanted to understand why their adoption rate was so much higher than the other ones were. Because we were building this really awesome tool chain, but why weren't teams using it? And so this particular customer, we implemented a new standard. So they brought in a new pipeline. And that meant that teams, that even teams that had legacy things were going to have to make some adaptations to get into this common standard. But what we did was we collaborated with the security group, and we made that pipeline also include security automation and automated controls. We adopted some OpenSCAP. If you're not familiar with that framework, it's a community that's trying to build automation in the security world. It's not everything, but it's more than what we had before. We adopted a lot of automated controls that as teams embrace that in their pipeline, they could inherit that control on their security thing. And it also meant we adopted, because we had this infrastructure as code, we were getting a lot of reuse. So we went from having about 60% reuse of design patterns and infrastructure to almost 90%, which basically means 90% of the stuff in our production is a reusable standard and not a special snowflake, not a special, bespoke server, as I like to call them, right? That's huge. Having 90% of the stuff in your infrastructure be standard instead of bespoke is a tremendous, because it just takes down the attack surface. So why did teams adopt this when they weren't adopting, basically the same pipeline other places? And I had this epiphany moment. When they used this pipeline, they got the infrastructure stuff automation quick and free, and it was a time saver for them. And they got the security testing quick and free, and they were able to inherit controls, which took 85% of the effort of getting to, in the federal space, authority to operate, which is the big gate to get to production. So security made it faster. Security made it easier. And by the way, more secure, right? It was like an everything. You could go faster and you could be more secure, because that was the big barrier. Sure, teams wanted to be secure, but I don't have the time, right? I'm too busy. I got deadlines. I promised the business I'd have this by this date. When security was actually helping first pace the automation to the other automation we were doing around infrastructure and code, but also make it faster and embrace that DevSecOps idea of, constantly improving and constantly getting the system, that constant feedback and speed, then teams did it, because the trade-off of effort to get into this pipeline was immediate payback with the benefits they were getting back out. And that was a huge aha moment for me, that to really bring adoption, one, it has to be really collaborative, but secondly, there's got to be that compelling case that for the effort I have to put in, I'm going to get something back out of it.
My headbanging moment was a lot about, I care about security, and I feel like everyone else should, but I can't figure out why other people don't. And so my path to epiphany was not so much one moment, but really a series of learning over time. The first thing that we started to try and do was to ask some questions that we had not asked before. Specifically, what's important to you? Asking the developers and the technology teams. And what are you trying to accomplish? It turns out developers have things like quarterly goals and deadlines, and they're trying to make new features so they can make money for the business. And when we were approaching them with these piles of work to do, that did not instill trust. So what we needed to do was put some frameworks around it. And we actually applied a few different principles from Shannon's DevSecOps manifesto. At eBay, one of the first we did was data and security science over fear, uncertainty, and doubt. So we actually teamed up, conveniently, the CTO, James Baresi, approached our CISO, Dave Cullinane, and said, Dave, I need a security score for each of these applications. That was actually a pretty convenient thing for us, because then we were able to say, okay, well, what should that score be? And we decided that for every customer-facing website, it was going to be a defect density score so that we could normalize across more than 24 applications. We decided that on a certain date, we were going to write down the number of bugs we knew about, divide it by million lines of code. That's our defect density. And then so once we had kind of buy-in from the decision makers, our application security team approached the development teams and said, okay, historically and truly, what kind of time do you have to work on this stuff? What's a realistic amount of work that you can put into that? And at the working level, we decided that we were going to go for a 20% reduction in the number of vulnerabilities on the customer-facing websites. Now, 20% is not a number that security people like. Security people like a number like 90. Security people like a number like 95. And if we had gone in and said, we're going to try and eliminate 90% of the bugs on the website, we probably would have gotten the same response that we got before, which is people stop coming to our meetings, people stop inviting us to our meetings, people stop reading our emails. And we were able to do it, which was super cool. We kind of took it a level further when I was on the Zynga security team, because what we did was another one of the DevSecOps manifesto fundamentals, which is business-driven security scores over rubber stamp security. So we would actually, instead of going to developers and saying, here is a pile of bugs, we would say to them, we've created for each of you, based on conversations that we've had with you about your business, how it works, the architecture of your application, we've created for you a studio risk profile. And we've got on the y-axis, bug value, on the x-axis, value to attackers. And so we were able to consider things like, and this came to us through our threat modeling exercises, there's cheating in an online game, and sometimes it doesn't matter much. Maybe you're duplicating, your bushel of apples, but you're not really hurting anyone else. So that's low priority. Maybe you're stealing someone else's stuff, their bushel of apples, and that's a slightly higher priority. Maybe there's a bug in Exampleville, which is sort of our game created by our shared technology group that you could then use to build Cityville, Frontierville, Yeoville, Xville. And if there's good code in Exampleville and it gets copied over, great. If there's not good code in Exampleville and it gets copied over, then you've got this multiplying effect. So bugs in Exampleville counted for more. There was a time when Zynga was kind of a big deal, and if a security bug was being talked about on a user community forum or being demonstrated on YouTube, that was kind of a big deal, so we were able to up the priority. And finally, some of the games actually had active secondary markets associated with the exchange of goods in-game. If that was the case, that was kind of a big deal. So we were able to go in and say, not all applications are created equal, not all bugs are created equal. We're actually going to help you to prioritize so that when we come and talk to you, you can trust us to take into consideration where you're coming from. The other headbanging moment I shared was with regards to security policy. And the DevSecOps manifesto fundamental that we applied in this case was open contribution and collaboration over security-only requirements. It's really different to go into a room and say, this is what we're gonna do, than to go into a room and say, here's the problem we need to solve, how should we approach it? So instead of me taking a 378-page document, making it into a 50-page document, and trying to shove it down someone's throat, by hosting a workshop, inviting the stakeholders, legal, HR, IT, operations, networking, and saying to them, we're gonna go public, we need to adhere to SOX, here's what we need to do, let's prioritize, let's talk about it. From a security perspective, here's the bar that we need to meet, you tell me how we're gonna go about it. And we actually ended up with security policies that were signed by the teams who had written them and who were expected to adhere to them, signed and dated, which was super cool. And then it actually made it such that they were going to follow the policy, which was also pretty convenient. The last fundamental from the DevSecOps manifesto that I'll share about is with regards to sharing threat intelligence versus keeping information to ourselves. Prior to my current role, I was a management consultant with a company called Cigital, now Synopsys, and I delivered more than 36 what's called BSIM assessments. BSIM is a software security framework. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend checking it out, BSIMM. There's an activity in BSIM with regards to sharing threat intelligence. And I talked to more than 36 organizations doing software security, and I said, do you share threat intelligence throughout your organization? And the vast majority of teams do not. At Zynga, we decided that in order for the security team to build trust with the other folks at the company, that we were gonna tell people when something was up. So if our executive staff began receiving malicious email attachments, not only did we have the technology in place, Ironport, to strip out those malicious attachments, we also emailed them and we said, look, you're being targeted. We want you to know this is happening right now. Leading up to the IPO, there were all sorts of recon attempts, social engineering that was attempted on employees, and we emailed everyone and said, look, this is what's happening. Everyone was on Facebook because that was the platform through which we played our games, and sometimes people would get these fake friend requests from Zynga Security. We would email them and say, hey, this is what's going on, it's not us. And I believe that by being transparent about what was going on and not holding that information so close, we were actually able to have better relationships with the other folks at the company.
Awesome. Two great stories today. So you're going to hear a lot more as we roll on throughout the agenda today. And next up, we're going to see DJ Schleen. DJ, you're up right next. No? Oh, I got it wrong. Sorry. It's Derek is up next. I had a whole thing about DJ. Now I got to talk about Derek. So just a moment.
Oh, I was gonna, before we handed it off too much, I did want to kind of give, to the security professionals from Dev and Ops, sort of a quick guide, I think, to the culture transformation, and maybe some other thoughts on that. But I really think there's sort of 3 C's, right? The first one from DevOps is that collaboration, that you have an opportunity and a choice, collaboration is a choice, to embrace the development and operations teams in the organization that you work. And if just because they don't invite you, just show up, right? Start that collaboration. I also think the more we can drive towards cross-functional teams, that is really a success criteria to me in a successful DevOps transformation. And in fact, when I talk to any new program, which I do a lot in the federal government because this is still a transformation that's very much ongoing, I usually say the first thing is if your teams aren't cross-functional, start with that. Start there. You don't have to change anyone's boss. You don't have to change anything else about who you report to, but make sure your teams represent all the skills you need to deliver and organize by features. That's a huge. And the third is competence. And this is a call that I have to the security community because this is where I, as someone in the development and the ops space, need the most help. It's not enough anymore for me to train my developers to look for SQL injection, right? That's great. My team just finished a serverless application. There's no SQL, right? I don't need them to know about SQL injection. I need them to understand command injection and component security. I need them to understand why, so that they can apply that to the new technology frontier that we're all driving towards. And so that's why, again, having security in the room, help us understand why, help us gain the competence to keep it secure. And that's why I love the idea of sharing those vulnerabilities. Tell us what it is we need to do and what we need to learn, because we're out there on the brave frontier of new technology, and we can't just take the checklist with us. It doesn't apply.
Yeah, that's great. So before we introduce the next talk, one of the things that I wanted to end on was asking the audience here how you feel that you show up in your organization. Are you a security professional? Lots of hands. Who would associate themselves as a developer? What about operations? Okay, we got some more people that are showing up nowadays that are not just security. So by the way, with the DevSecOps movement, you're all three. Whether you like it or not, you're going to have to learn how to develop code to be able to look at the security of your applications going forward. You're going to have to understand all components and third-party parts that are part of your applications and your software stacks. There's a whole bunch that we have to know. One of the things that I would tell you that I'm now chasing is adversary return rate. Who here is looking at things like adversary return rate? That's awesome. Adversary return rate is how many times does an adversary return to your application and how often. In other words, if you're not actually reducing their ROI, which we've all talked about for many years, but with DevSecOps, you can now do that by getting enough instrumentation into your applications to be able to associate it with an adversary return rate. And as a developer, that's much like a customer return rate. So why can't we measure it better, right? If we're just really dealing with software, we can actually start to figure out exactly these things. So I asked a whole bunch of people in the room, how many are Dev, Sec, and Ops? You're here today. Who wants to be a DevSecOps? I got to tell you, that's the future. And like I said, whether you like it or not, it's where we're all headed, because the cloud has caused us to all look at things differently. We're all moving in a direction. And today, there's a whole bunch of stories from really big companies that are employing people like all of us to do this and to do it really well. So I'm here to learn from all of you. I'm a learnaholic, not a workaholic. I hope you find yourselves learning today as much as I hope to as well. And I know I speak for a couple of us here that we all want to see you guys really be able to drive this at your organizations. Please reach out if you need any help. We're here to help. Any last words? No? No? All right. Thank you so much. All right. Q&A. There's microphones in the aisle, but they're not on yet. They are now. This is what DevSecOps and Agile looks like. We're doing Q&A now, all right? Come on, people. Everybody's got questions. All right, great.
I have never heard the adversary return rate again. I work for a communication company, and we're constantly attacked. So how can you... I would like to know just a little bit more about that. Are you saying that you actually are able to determine this adversary and is doing that, and then they come back even though from some other angle?
Yeah, it's a great question. So adversary return rate is all about knowing who. So some of your threat intel can tell you who, if you have the right threat intel. You can also understand a little bit about their TTPs. I need coffee. Techniques, tactics, and procedures. And what that does for you is how your actual application is being attacked is something that can help you to determine whether or not you've got one or more adversaries doing the same thing. So hopefully that helps you to understand a little bit more. And return rate is all about how often are they coming, how often are you seeing the same TTPs, what is it that's being, how is your application being attacked?
Thanks for all this great stuff today. My question is kind of jumping off of this adversary return rate, and Carolyn talked about defect density. I'm wondering, especially in the era of DevSecOps, what some other good measurements and metrics that you guys use and that you share with the developers and ops teams to really help improve the overall process, security, speed, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I've heard a lot from many people that are going to talk today. Adversary return rate is one. Defect density, time between defects, mean time to identification's another. Do you ladies have any?
Yeah, I'd say I shared some very specific ones about how we did it at Zynga with the studio risk profiles. I think more generically, most defects can be categorized according to criticality. And as Shannon was talking about, it's really important to have associated SLAs with different defects that have different criticality.
Yeah, from a DevOps perspective, I like measuring the sort of velocity, the cycle time, and the lead time. That sort of gets you how efficient you are in your process. But from the actual code quality, I tend to look inside the team at things like cyclomatic complexity and defect density, but that's feedback for the team. That's not necessarily insightful for the organization, because it's like not news to anyone that your legacy application has a lot of defects and a lot of complexity and your brand new shiny thing doesn't. But it's useful for a team. And if you start introducing tools like static application scanning or dynamic scanning, you'll start, or even just static code scanning, you'll start getting a quantity of defects and actually watching not the quantity, but the burn rate. How quickly are you burning those down as a team? Tells you something about the team's productivity and getting to a more secure place.
As I'm passing the microphone back, I'll actually add just a couple more, which are, I think, like top-end vulnerabilities is really important. So as an industry, we have the OWASP Top 10, which is really fantastic for education and awareness. But to know a specific organization's top vulnerability types can actually help an organization to do things like customized training accordingly, right? Like, so Paula, her teams don't need to learn about SQL injection, but they do need to learn about command injection, as well as things like you can also write custom filters for static analysis. You can actually use information like, what are my top X vulnerability categories? Maybe it's top 3. And then finally, what are recurring bugs, right? So, great to know what bugs are there, but which ones keep coming back?
As a follow-up to that, have you found that, especially as you're going for those cross-functional teams, that the security metrics and the QA quality metrics are starting to kind of merge more collaboration there?
Yeah, I think all three of us would agree that they are merging, but I would say that with adversary return rate, that's a differentiator to quality. So your code quality is not really necessarily going to give you better rate of return with adversaries. It's something to keep in mind. We'll take one more over here. And then offline, all three of us would love to answer any questions you guys have.
How do you balance your different DevOps, DevSecOps teams so that you still have specialized people, realizing that not everyone can be an expert in Java development, not everyone can know .NET, not everyone know Python, not everyone can know the firewalls. I've been doing this for a long time, and it takes a lot to become an expert in any one of these categories. And yet I'm hearing, oh, everyone needs to know it all. They can't. So how do you deal with that?
I think in an organization, you have a specialty, and it's your obligation to figure out how to be an expert in something that people need. I go back to value and flow. So what's the most valuable thing that you can contribute to the teams that you have? In my case, it's adversary management. So knowing adversaries, knowing what they do, knowing how to hunt them down, knowing how to provide that information back is something that I do. And I would tell you I learn Python and all of these things all the time. It's just you have to think about what your specialty is and how you're going to help your audience.
So I guess more specifically, my concern is, yeah, I know Python and I know security and I know networks. Now, how do I tell my developers, no, you can't go start changing the network firewalls? That's not what DevSecOps is.
All right, hold on.
So this is a challenge, right? And in a large organization, you probably have some degree of siloing just because you're huge, right? I guess this is why I say collaboration is a choice. The best quote I heard from a team, it warmed my heart, was, this is from my teams all have mascots. And so one of our teams is the Tigers. And they're sort of, they were working on something and somebody said, we had a new employee come in. If one Tiger knows it, they all know it. And this is a team that has a crazy diverse background. There's developers, there's ops persons, there's a former networker on there. And it doesn't require everyone on the team to know everything. They collaborate so well that if there's a network vulnerability, the network guy knows it and tells everybody, right? And that's why it matters that it's cross-functional. If you're living in your silo and you're not meeting with your developers on a daily basis, then they're not going to know that. I mean, so I think it's the fidelity of your collaboration is what makes that successful.
Yeah, and I would just say one last thing on that. My security team builds software. They didn't start that way. They basically moved a lot of our applications up, and that became a way to actually learn the things that were necessary to help everybody else with. And I think that there's, lots to be learned around not siloing, figuring out how to be experts and really contribute back. So Mark's now going to pull us off the stage. It was great talking to you all, and we're really proud of this. Thank you.